In the not-too-distant future, a revolution is brewing, one that will change the very fabric of our existence. It's a tale of cells that hold the key to unlocking the mysteries of life itself. Let us venture into the unknown, for in this age of stem cells, anything is possible.
Look at your shirt. I love this.
Taylor made it.
Yes, his are the best. Where can I get one? I love it.
Oh, I think we're going to make them available online. So you can order your own not plastic bag t-shirt. It's good. It'll be on our website, Taylor? Okay. Yeah, it'll be in the description.
That's awesome. I'm going to order one today.
Happy New Year, Jan.
Happy New Year.
I haven't seen you since this year has begun. And what a year it's been so far. The news about the fires is all over the place. And, yesterday I met a couple from LA. They were in the evacuation zone. So they grabbed whatever they could, protected whatever they had, and still made it down here for their appointment. And this puts everything into perspective, and you kind of think about like what's most important, like what would you do in this situation? And everyone says the things that are unreplaceable: your family, your health. So it's been a tough time for everyone. We have so many patients that come in from there, and we have we just know a lot of people that are affected. So our hearts go out to all of those folks. So 2025, again, off to a rocky start, but it's also officially the stem cell era, the beginning of the stem cell era. December 18th last year, the very first stem cell treatment, we're talking about like actual stem cell treatment, was approved by FDA. So Mesoblast receives FDA approval for their mesenchymal stromal cell therapy for graft versus host disease in children. Yeah. And they've been on this mission for a very long time. So it's amazing to see that they finally achieved approval. And it's just the beginning to a long line of treatments that are going to follow. But it is a monumental achievement. Yeah. So we're officially living in the stem cell age. Yep.
It's going to be a great year. Yes, this is exciting news. And I think we're all excited, to see what the ripples and evolution are from authorizations like this one.
It's so interesting to read commentary from very reputable, the smartest people in our country, talk about the irrelevance of MSC treatments, or there's no science behind it, and those kinds of comments. And then suddenly you see an approval happen, and those same people are now saying, oh, the regulations are now getting softer. Yeah. So we must all learn to read between the lines and trust in your gut instinct. And we can tell you with confidence that nothing has changed in the regulatory world, at least for us. It's business as usual with FDA. We haven't seen anything different. And so to pick up on our last podcast from last year, we are going to get right into the legal issues regarding stem cells. And we were talking about, why are stem cells illegal? Meaning, we talked about how it's not actually the right question to be asking. The question really is, why are stem cells regulated as drugs? Drugs versus, in the United States, they're either placed into two buckets. They're either a drug or they're a human cell tissue-based product, HCTP. So it's one of those two things. So how do you know whether the stem cell product that you're dealing with is going to fall into one of two categories. Yes. So let's go over those criteria. Okay, so the 4 criteria, it's technically 3 criteria with 2.5 subpart. So here they are. The first is that the cells have to be minimally manipulated. And the second is that they have to be only for homologous use. Third, they can't be combined with any other treatments. Okay, and then the fourth is they cannot have a systemic effect, or they can have a systemic effect, but if they do, the cells have to be autologous, or they have to come from a 1st or 2nd degree blood relative. Yeah. Or therefore reproductive use. So these are the criteria, and each and every one of these is a podcast episode in and of itself. And so what we're going to do today is tackle the first criteria, which is minimal manipulation. And the reason this is the most important is because this is where most of the technologies that we discuss, or most of the major issues, are sort of hung up around this one criteria. What is minimal manipulation? So, fun exercise. And for our listeners, the few of you here, maybe you can think about what you would just, when you hear the word minimal manipulation, what is the logical definition you would think of? Jan?
To me, I start with the word manipulation, and manipulation suggests there's a deliberate connotation to the word, an attempt to change the nature of something, the way it functions, its mechanisms, to potentially obtain a different outcome, right, than would be naturally occurring. So when I think about minimal manipulation, I think about don't do that. Don't try and change the nature or mechanistic capability of something like a cell.
Totally agree. Manipulate, yeah. Don't change it from its original state to what is put back in the body, right? Yeah. I guess that would be the logical definition. But let's read the official definition. And the official definition comes from FDA because this is FDA law. And so drug law comes with its own definitions. So, and even their definition is up for debate, and it actually is up for debate in the Supreme Court. At least that's what the request has been. So, yeah, what's the actual definition, Jan?
So FDA delineates between structural tissue and non-structural tissue. And for structural tissue, FDA defines minimal manipulation as processing that does not alter the original relevant characteristics of the tissue relating to the tissue's utility for reconstruction, repair, or replacement. And for non-structural tissues, processing that does not alter the relevant biological characteristics of cells or tissues.
Out of those two definitions, the second is straightforward. The first is what causes a lot of confusion, because a lot of the cells that are being used can come from structural tissues, but we're still talking about cells themselves, not tissues. So we're using cells from tissues, and in order to get those cells, there is a level of processing that has to occur on that tissue. And they are saying that if you process that tissue to get the cells, even though you don't change the cells at all, and the cells are what you put back in, that is still defined as a drug, because that is more than minimal manipulation.
The question of a tissue is an interesting one that I think segues directly into medical and personal autonomy. We see a phrase used in some amicus briefs by think tanks and similar, my body, my cells, right? Which is the idea that your cells are medically recognized by your body. There's a level of personal autonomy there. Why do they need to be regulated as a drug, as something foreign to the body, when in reality, they're not. They come from your body, right? So this is kind of a philosophical question that is foundational to a lot of case law and rulings over the last decade that tend to fall on both sides. Some courts find that cells are appropriately regulated as drugs, and some find that they're not. There's a lot of flip-flopping, especially lately as we head into 2025.
Yeah, and some important rulings are going to have to be made. And it's going to fall on, I think that the definition and the hangups are on technicalities of how cells are processed, rather than the integrity of the cells that are going back in, right? If the biological characteristics and the function and the cell itself, you've done every test that you can humanly do to show that the cells are unchanged, unmanipulated, then that should be the threshold, not the act of processing, because the act of processing may have more to do with the processor, right? The quality of the processor and the quality of the processing, as opposed to the act itself. Okay, so there are logical examples of HCTPs, or not logical examples, but very straightforward examples that I think we can all agree are HCTPs. This would be a fun quiz time. Okay, so Jan, if I took blood transfusion, one person to another, is that a drug?
Not in my opinion, no.
Okay, so that is correct. Ding, ding, ding. You're taking blood that's not been changed, especially when you do a whole blood transfer. You're taking whole blood and putting that from one person to another. No issue there. If you are, and that doesn't have to be your own, right? Because if you're running out of blood and you're getting someone else's, a total stranger, right? That's been tested, but a total stranger, that's okay. So it seems to not even be. And one would argue, actually, are those foreign cells?
Technically.
Because they actually did not come from your own body. So they are actually foreign cells, but they do have the same biological function. It is performing as blood would in your body. This is why that would fall under the HCTP ruling. But how about some further processing in blood, like plasma?
I would argue that the separation to obtain plasma does not make it a drug, because you're not altering that mechanistic function or the nature of how it performs in the body.
So the separation there seems to be okay. So it passed the test that is not manipulating. Last question on our quiz, Jan. This is a toughie, okay? So in reproduction, you can take cells from one person and you can take cells from another person, and you mix them up in a lab to create an embryo. So it's it's different from what you've created now in the lab. Is different from what you started, the starting material, and now you can either implant that back into one of those individuals, or you can implant it into a third party, like an unrelated third party. Is this an HCTP or is it a drug? Is it more than minimally manipulated?
If we follow that common sense approach, it certainly seems to be. I mean, we've undertaken an attempt to change everything from the original components, which is a plural. It's components coming from different individuals, introduced into a laboratory environment. The outcome is something different than what was introduced, and potentially yet another actor, right, involved in continued growth and change of the original cells. So that common sense approach, it certainly seems to exceed the threshold of minimal manipulation.
So Jan, we're both wrong. This is how confusing this world gets. Even though they are clearly cells, they actually don't fall under either drug. They are not an HCTP. It is actually medical law, just medical practice. It falls under the realm of medical practice. It is a medical procedure. So even though it doesn't happen within the same surgical session, which we'll get into as to how that created a whole bunch of confusion. Despite all that, and despite the fact that there's a ton of processing that happens, this is considered a medical procedure. So it's awfully confusing. Okay, let's go through some case law, shall we?
Sounds great.
So one of the most well-known cases, the first, Regenerative Sciences versus the U.S. In 2014.
The court found in that case that culturing and expanding MSCs constituted more than minimal manipulation. And because they found that it altered the biological characteristics of the cells. That ruling had ripples that still affect us today. MSC culturing, such as the kind that we do here, still falls under drug regulation.
So Regenerative Sciences, what were they doing? They're a clinic that took bone marrow from patients, their own bone marrow, and then extracted mesenchymal stem cells from that bone marrow and then cultured them. And culturing means taking those cells and just increasing the number. So feeding those cells to reproduce, to make more of them. So essentially just making replications of these cells and then giving them back. And it was the first time in court where FDA said, because the act of culturing, just increasing the number, again, logically wouldn't mean that you're manipulating. You're simply increasing the number. So the cells are the same. That was the argument. And so FDA was put in a spot where they actually had to now define it. They had to say, are cultured cells more than minimally manipulated? And it was at that time where they made that determination that yes, if you were culturing cells, they would be defined as a drug, period. There's no exception to that rule. Yeah. So to this day, anybody that is doing anybody that is culturing cells are more than minimally manipulating. Therefore, they are a drug. So if they want to make their product available in the United States, they would have to go through drug trials, like actual clinical trials. A lot of times people are traveling overseas to have access to cultured cell products because they're not available here readily. Without culturing, a bone marrow transplant in and of itself, taking bone marrow from one person and giving it to another. That happens with cancer patients all the time. You take healthy bone marrow from one individual and give it to a cancer patient. That falls under HCTP. So that is clearly non-manipulated. Again, if you take out the stem cells from that bone marrow and you further culture them, that's where they draw the line and say it's a drug. Okay. So what's the second case?
So I think the next case that we saw that had broad-reaching significance for minimal manipulation and cell culturing was the U.S. versus the U.S. Stem Cell Clinic, and that was in 2019. The court ruled that enzymatic digestion of tissues use of centrifugation and similar processing constituted more than minimal manipulation. And there was a significant impact from this ruling on primarily on SVF, which I'd appreciate it if you can talk a little bit more about SVF, because a lot of the case law centers on SVF but has implication for other culturing processes.
So when we talked about blood as an example, where you separate blood out and then you give a part of the blood, a component of the blood back to somebody, that seems to be okay or less than minimal manipulation. If you look at structural tissue like fat, this is where they have, in this case, drawn the line. They say, okay, remember in the rule of minimal manipulation, for structural tissues, if that structural tissue has been changed, then that is more than minimal manipulation. But everyone has read that as, no, if you are transferring tissue from one person to another, and you're, for the purpose of transferring tissue, like you're trying to replace someone's muscle, you want to make sure that you put back in muscle and not something else. They want to make sure that you're not changing the fundamental structure of that tissue. It was interpreted that, no, if you are changing the structure of the tissue to get the cells that you're trying to isolate, then the sheer act of separating the cells from the tissue, and there's really no way to do it other than some kind of enzyme to digest the tissue. You have to do something to dislodge the cells from that tissue. But that simple act constitutes more than minimal manipulation. It rocked everybody's world, because it's, I remember talking to a legislator about this, and, we use the example of gold. It's like, okay, well, in this case, if gold are the cells, right, same gold, it's as if, like, okay, if the gold was found in a river, floating in a river, and you harvested that, that's okay. But if the gold was lodged in a rock and you had to break the rock to get the gold, again, the outcome is the same. That would be a drug. That's the dividing line. And it seems just so, in some ways, again, not true to the essence of the rule, right? Minimal manipulation, again, of what is going back into your body, not so much what is being done to get the cells that are going to go back into your body. Yeah.
It also seems very inconsistent. I mean, the visual of getting gold out of a rock, I think, is a great one versus out of a river. But the fact of the matter is, if we liken the river to blood, and we go back to that earlier example of separating blood and plasma, which is not considered a drug process, right? Blood itself has form. I mean, it has a form, it has a structure. It simply happens to be liquid. But how is removing something from that structure different than removing something from a solid structure?
Again, I think the argument is that these enzymes that are used to digest the tissues, right, to break up the tissues, can create some kind of manipulation. So perhaps the way, and this goes into maybe sort of at the end of the discussion, like, what can we do to mitigate this? It's more of perhaps having something in place where they're reviewing what is happening to the products to determine whether the end product is truly manipulated or not, right? Yes, and that the processing, someone overseeing the actual processing of that whole, from start to finish, to ensure that it's done safely and done appropriately. But again, looking at the integrity of the final product that's going back into the person. Perhaps more focus has to be put on that, as opposed to having broad-reaching rules of, well, you can't use, well, it may be perfectly fine to digest fat to achieve this. Maybe you need the right kind of separation technique, but not all separation techniques are created equal. And so as technology moves and as we implement better standards, we should be able to do these things very easily and safely without changing the cells themselves. Yeah.
Well, it stands to reason that we could. I mean, human tissues are not a static substance. They break down and change on their own of completely organic processes. So to not allow that at all without considering it a drug-based process, it doesn't really ring true, I think, with the technology or with the human body.
Yeah, well said. So the last one we'll hit on, and we can't talk about all of them because we'll be here all day, but the last one is the Cell Surgical Network case in 2022. And this one's making headlines again as we head into 2025 because there's been flip-flopping between the courts in a series of rulings, and now there is a request to bring this same case before the U.S. Supreme Court, which, if the Supreme Court agrees to hear it, could obviously have very far-reaching implications, whatever they decide. So this case goes back to SVF again, and I don't know if I explained this, but SVF is essentially taking the fat, digesting it, and taking putting an enzyme in there, and then spinning it down. And what happens is that you get a pellet of cells, okay, after you do this. So the just like if you've heard of PRP, people go to clinics to get PRP. PRP is non-regulated, by the way, right? It's not a drug. Insurance doesn't cover it or anything. But what it basically is, you go in, you take some blood out, and they'll spin it down, and you get plasma. What you're injecting back in is plasma that is rich in platelets, hence platelet-rich plasma, and you're giving that back. So it's concentrated, and you're giving that back. But again, you're not allowed to have any kind of claims to it of what it can do. But I think people think that that's some kind of a stem cell treatment, but it really isn't. It's just you're getting a part of your blood back. You can, with fat in the SVF world, they're saying this is unfair. If you're taking fat and you're separating the fat to get the cells, and the cells are a mixture of cells. Some are going to be fat cells, some blood cells, some MSCs in there. You're going to get a whole mixture of cells. But that pellet is what came from you. So when we put that pellet back into you, that should be perfectly safe. Now, in general, I think it is. The SVF has been studied extensively. There are a lot of papers written about SVF, and for the most part, it's generally safe. Does it work? Probably minimally at most, just given the fact that everybody is different. It seems that every person has a different amount of cells in their body, right? And the quality of their cells are different as well. So if you're using that starting material, what you're putting back might not be a very good quality. And so what it can do is can be very limiting. And so you're paying a lot of money for a service that you don't know will work. And the doctor will have no idea because they're not looking at your cells. They have no idea what the quality of those cells are. They're simply just giving you a procedure. And chances are, in order to sell those procedures, they're telling you that it's going to do A, B, and C. So that seems to be the hang up. We shouldn't be selling products that we're not sure if they're going to help. So there's twofold. And in this lawsuit, I think there are, and FDA's issues that they're having right now with clinics is, what are the claims being made? And And I think in court they will make a decision as to, is our processes like SVF going to be consistently regulated by FDA? Yeah.
Well, and there's an FTC, a Federal Trade Commission component, I think, in practical application of a lot of these cases, because how we talk about cell therapies really matters, and we do want to accurately represent them.
Yeah. I think that, we were talking about how clinics are starting to follow state law, right? And that is, it seems like a lot of states are starting to come up with their own stem cell regulations. And clinics are sort of following those under the practice of medicine, is it under the umbrella of practice of medicine?
Yes. So most recently we saw in 2023 and 2024, Nevada and Utah coming out with laws that allowed more open marketing of biologics that have not yet been approved by FDA. And they're saying that to disallow such practices constituted in essence, an inhibition. It created a barrier to access of appropriate medicine by people in need. But the problem here is that, federal law supersedes state law. And so by states attempting to maneuver around also doesn't address the core issue of how we're thinking about drugs, how we're thinking about tissues, how we're regulating both, and what to do with a technology like a cell therapy, especially particular cell types that, I would argue belong in their own class. There's something different than we've seen before. Our current regulations aren't adequately addressing patient needs. So what can we do differently going forward, I think, is the biggest question. Rather than trying to pigeonhole investigational cellular therapies into one or the other, what can we do differently?
Yeah. And I think we're coming head to head with that in the coming years, for sure. One thing that makes this so difficult is, given the laws, what's straightforward is the law is sort of black and white, and with all these previous case law, you're sure. Like, for instance, Hope Bio, our world, we take MSCs from fat and then we culture them. We culture them, as far as I'm concerned, better than anyone else can. And we make a great product. And what the product we make at the end is exactly what we took out from you, just in giant quantities, in giant healthy quantities. And the act of doing this is clearly defined as a drug. This is why we have to go through clinical trials, and we have to invest a lot in doing that so that we can finally have an FDA-approved product. But an FDA-approved product for what? So in order to be a drug, you have to have a drug label. You have to have an indication for use. You cannot have a drug without an indication for use, and you have to have a claim. And the claim, because the definition of a drug is the intent to treat something. Okay, so you have to, what are we treating? And that is always the hardest part to this, right? These cells are, and I think fundamentally to package it in as a drug is so flawed, because in our bodies, these cells naturally exist to perform so many functions for everything, for strengthening our immune system, to increasing our blood flow, to so improving our circulation, to regenerating our organs when they're falling apart, to help in so many ways. So to try and, stuff it into one category and say, well, this is doing one specific thing for this one specific disease is I think it's just not not a logical approach, and I think it is very limiting. Yeah, and if we continue this way, I think it will be a much longer road to seeing these treatments readily available. So hopefully, we'll have better solutions coming up in the near future. Yeah.
I'm hopeful for what this year holds. I think we're seeing an unprecedented amount of conversations like this one among legislators, scientists, researchers, drug manufacturers. And if we get enough people asking the same questions and attempting to develop answers, I'm confident in our ability, our communal ability to develop good ones. So 2025 should be great.
Yeah. Agreed. Well, so we talked a lot about regulations, and this topic of minimal manipulation is important. Next one we're going to talk about is non-homologous use. That's another big one. But for this, we appreciate any comments. So if you guys have any questions, please ask them in the comments. We want to make sure that we address everything, and if we don't know something, we'll research it and try and get you an answer. But we're sort of touching on these things very broadly, but yes, Taylor seems to think we didn't have an organized conversation, but hopefully, now he's blushing.
It's a dialogue.
It's a dialogue.
It's a dialogue.
It's a dialogue.
Yeah.
There's so many moving parts, so many topics here. So forgive us if it's not as structured, but we're trying to cover a lot. Yeah.
Well, but the reality of what we call, you hear frequently called leading edge technology, right, is that you lead at the edge, you learn together, and you move forward together, and you're going into new spaces. And yeah, it's a dialogue.
Okay. Well, we're learning together. Okay. So thanks for tuning in. Bye.
Bye.